It is the morning after. For the moment, there is calm in Caracas. But there's also confusion. Who exactly is now in charge of Venezuela? One thing's certain, it's not him. Nicolas Maduro, handcuffed and shackled, spent last night in a New York jail. In truth, it really doesn't matter who calls themselves El Presidente. There's only one El Jefe, the boss.
We are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
Trump said that Vice President Delcy Rodriguez would do as she was told. She obviously didn't get the memo and called for Maduro to be set free. But so far, there's little sign of opposition. In Trump world, one thing now counts above all: sheer, naked power. We'll get live reaction from the government here, from Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, Darren Jones, as well as Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel, the Deputy Leader of Reform, Richard Tice, and the former Chief of MI6, Sir John Sawers. Plus, with us throughout the show, journalist and broadcaster Mark Urban, Sunday Times political editor Caroline Wheeler, and editor-at-large of The Sun, Harry Cole. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips, and a Happy New Year to you all. Forgive me if I begin 2026 on a personal note. To all intents and purposes, this morning, Venezuela is an American colony. I've got mixed feelings about that. Whatever the White House says, I don't think this is really about drugs. It's about oil. Full disclosure, my family came to England from Guyana, the country next door to Venezuela. It's where I grew up and where I went to school. It's also where I learnt to handle a rifle. For almost 2 centuries, Venezuela has claimed more than half of Guyana's territory, the Essequibo region, as its own. My generation grew up preparing for an invasion. But I don't think anyone really thought we'd go to war over impenetrable rainforest. And then, in 2015, American companies hit oil in Guyanese waters. At 30 billion barrels, it's one of the biggest oil finds in decades. Unsurprisingly, Caracas immediately rediscovered its enthusiasm for Guyanese territory, even redrawing the map of Venezuela sent to every school to include Essequibo. So I don't think there's much doubt what is driving Mr. Trump's military adventure. He wants to protect America's vast oil interests in the region and to feed his refineries with Venezuelan crude. And if that means upsetting the international rules-based order, I don't think Mr. Trump will be too bothered. After all, American presidents, including Democrats like Kennedy and Obama, have always been clear on one thing. The first rule of the rules-based order is that America makes the rules to suit America. Well, let's get the first live reaction to events in Venezuela and Donald Trump's words last night from the government here. And I can now speak to the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, Darren Jones, who's in studio. Good morning, Chief Secretary. What do we know? President Trump says this was a successful operation militarily and politically. Do you agree?
Well, the first thing to say is it was an American operation. The United Kingdom was not involved in any way. We were not informed of it beforehand. So it's not for us to judge whether it had been a success or not. That's for the Americans to speak to. I think the important thing now, given the events that have unfolded over the last 48 hours, is that we are quickly able to get to a point where we can get to a peaceful transition to a president in Venezuela that has the support of the people of Venezuela.
Well, look, though, I want to come to some of that in a second, but you must have a view about, for example, whether this was lawful.
It's for the Americans to set out the legal basis for their operation. This was their operation, not NATO, not ours in any way. I don't think the Americans have done that yet. I'm sure they will do in due course. Of course, the United Kingdom abides by international law. We're advocates for international law and the rules-based order. But I can't give you a view right now of President Trump's legal basis for his operation, because that's for the Americans to explain.
Of course, the Americans will, and indeed President Trump did explain what he thought the legal basis was. He was going after a couple of drug dealers, Mr. and Mrs. Maduro. Surely that should give you some basis for deciding whether you think this was lawful or not. Because, frankly, if it's just a straightforward abduction or invasion of a foreign country, we didn't think Mr. Putin's invasion was lawful, so why is this one?
Well, as I've said on your show in the past, in other circumstances around the world, it's not for politicians to make judgments around international law.
You did make a judgment. You made a judgment that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was unlawful. What's different about this?
Well, as I say, it's for international courts to make judgments on international law. It's not for me or for any other minister or opposition politician to make a judgment on that. As I say, it's for the Americans to have the legal basis for their operation. I can't, as a UK government minister, speak on behalf of the American administration.
Look, well, let me just ask you about a very practical point that this morning. Is the United Kingdom government going to recognise the new president's administration? We think the new president is Mrs. Rodriguez. Are we going to recognise that administration as the legitimate government of Venezuela?
Well, look, I think we need to wait to see what unfolds in terms of the detail of that question over the coming days. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, the United Kingdom, but also our European and other allies, will be engaging with their counterparts in the United States and with our embassy, of course, in Venezuela to understand what the next steps are. I don't think it's clear yet what the situation is in Venezuela, so we can't.
The French have decided that Mrs. Machado, the opposition leader who it is thought actually won the last election there, is the legitimate president. They can make a decision. We seem completely unable to make any decisions about anything on this.
It's not for the French or for the British to decide who the president of Venezuela is. It's for the people of Venezuela to make that decision, which is why we say...
So Macron was wrong to announce that he recognised Machado as president.
That's why we say the transition is now important. Whoever becomes president of Venezuela should do so democratically with the consent of the people of Venezuela. It's not for a third country to make that decision on behalf of Venezuela.
The de facto president, I suspect, actually, and he more or less said this yesterday, is Donald Trump. You said we weren't warned of this raid. Do you feel a bit uncomfortable that our closest ally, with whom we have a special relationship, goes and attacks another country where, in a region where we have a lot of interests, a lot of former colonies and so on, and didn't bother to mention it to us?
Well, look,
It's Grenada all over again, isn't it?
I think that's probably slightly different. Grenada, of course, Commonwealth connection, and of course that was a different time when Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and the Queen were told about operations there. But I think the situation in respect to Venezuela is different. Congress in the United States was not informed, let alone allies or other countries around the world.
Yeah, but that's because they thought Congress would leak. Are they saying that... you're saying that the Americans think that our government, our Prime Minister, your number 10 operation would leak as well? That's why they didn't tell you?
No, that's not what they've said, and it's not what I've said. All I'm saying is that we were not informed. We were not part of any operation. We had no contribution to it, and it wasn't a multinational operation in the way that it might be in other circumstances.
All right, look, let me get one last question on this. Mr. Trump yesterday said that the United States would now run Venezuela until it decides to do otherwise. I think we used to have a name for that. Colonialism. Are we now in favour of colonialism?
We're not in favour of colonialism, and we're not entirely clear yet what President Trump meant by those comments yesterday.
No, he's pretty clear. He says, we're in charge until we decide otherwise.
Sure, but it's for the Americans now and for Venezuela to set out what happens in the coming days. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, we shouldn't make assumptions or guess what might happen next in certain hypothetical scenarios.
We don't have to make any assumption. President Trump has been pretty clear. He said, we are going to run Venezuela. We will decide when we can stop running Venezuela and pass on power in his word was, judicious way. It's pretty clear. We must have a view on that, surely.
But we don't know the shape, the timescale, the details of that. And as I say, we don't know yet.
So
either in
isn't
the
all
UK.
right as long as it's in the right form?
No, that's not what I said. All I said
Well, it is what you said.
No, it's not what I said. What I said is we don't know the details yet of what's happening in Venezuela. And it would be wrong for government ministers to try to make assumptions or to comment on hypotheticals about the future. We're engaging with our counterparts. Of course we are. Our embassy is working in Venezuela. But we should understand what's going to happen next before we comment. That's what the public would expect of a grown-up professional government to do.
No, I don't think so. I think the public would expect a grown-up government to be consistent, because I suspect if it had been anybody but the Americans, as in the case of Russia, if the Chinese did something similar in the Pacific, you would say exactly what you said about Putin. But we don't seem to be able to say this about America. What would happen if they decided, and he was pretty clear about this too, when he was asked about Cuba, what would we be saying if this were not Venezuela, but Cuba, or Panama, or Greenland? Is it sort of okay for our allies to waltz in wherever they think they need to snatch somebody who's done something naughty?
So, Trevor, I think a lot of the basis of your previous two questions, again, are around assumptions of things that may or may not happen in the world. I can't go through all of those.
They're about what Mr. Trump told the world yesterday.
No, I think you're pushing them to the extreme there. As I say, the UK respects international law and the rules-based order. We are an advocate for it. We conduct ourselves on that basis, and we expect other countries to do so as well. There's no question about that. But as I say, what's happened in Venezuela has happened. We now need to try to move as quickly as possible to transition to a legitimate leader of Venezuela. But that is a decision for the people of Venezuela.
Let me try this in just one final way. Prime Minister said yesterday that he's an advocate for international law. Can you cite any element of any international convention or law that gives the United States permission to go to a foreign country, abduct its president and his wife, recognised, by the way, by other countries, and take them to an American jail? What piece of international law supports that action?
Look, I'm not qualified to give an answer to that
Prime
question.
Minister said he supports international law. He must have been pretty clear what he had in mind. And he hasn't told you what he has in mind?
Neither of us will make judgments on that question. It's for the Americans to set out the legal basis for their operations. We are not spokespeople for the American administration, Trevor. We're spokespeople for the UK government.
I'm asking you not about the operations. I'm asking you about what the Prime Minister said about what we think as a country. He was clear. He supports international law. And I'm just saying, asking you, what element of international law can you imagine supports this particular action?
You're asking me what the legal basis for the American operation was. I'm not a spokesperson for the American administration. Okay. It's for them to set that out.
All right. Mr. Trump has warned Iran this week not to fire on protesters. Do you think this is a warning to Supreme Leader Khomeini?
Again, you have to ask the American administration. I'm sorry not to be able to answer your questions, Trevor, but I'm a British government minister. I can tell you what the position of British policy is.
You can see why this is so peculiar. You lot come in and tell me again and again how close we are to the Americans. The Prime Minister is very influential with Mr. Trump. He's the Trump whisperer and all that. Mm-hmm. When Mr. Trump does something like this, suddenly we weren't told. We don't really have an opinion about whether it's legal or not. We don't really have an opinion about whether it works or not. You can understand why it feels a little bit odd for you to be saying what you're saying.
No, I disagree. When it comes down to a sovereign issue about the UK economy or Britain's interests, of course we are involved, and of course we have an important relationship with the Americans, where that relationship has effect in relation to whatever issue it is you're talking about. When it's something that's unilaterally an issue for the United States...
You guys never have any trouble with saying what you think about what Putin's done, or what Netanyahu has done, or what has been done in other parts of Africa or Latin America. Suddenly, when it's the United States, we have nothing to say. We don't know. It's only the United States business. What happened to all of the promises that you made before the election about standing up for international law, for human rights, for doing things by the book?
Mm-hmm.
By the book,
Yeah.
by the way, was your was your leader's a big mantra.
And
by the rules, I beg your pardon.
And we, the United Kingdom, do that and shall continue to do it because.
And we expect our allies to do it, don't we?
The rules-based order relies on countries around the world following it. That's how it works. But as I say, I can't comment on the administration of another country about issues that relate to their country. I'm not a spokesperson for other countries, Trevor.
All right, let's talk about some domestic questions. 18 months ago, you came into government offering political integrity instead of chaos, economic growth instead of austerity. Let's look. At the end of last year, when I last spoke to one of your colleagues, you'd lost 5 ministers through their own errors of judgment. Growth was flat. Prime Minister said last week in his message to Labour Party members, puts restoring hope at the top of his agenda. What's the hope here?
Well, look, let me tell you about hope, and then let me tell you about the 2 points you raised, because I disagree with your conclusions on both of them. Look, the question for 2026 is this is our second full calendar year in government. Lots of the things that we have gotten on with starting to deliver in 2025 will start to become a reality for people across the country, whether it's around pay or public services or their community. And so what the Prime Minister has been talking about is that this is a year where we kind of turn the corner from a very difficult 14, 15 years since the banking crisis, and we start to see those green shoots for people across the country. But look, on your question of ethics and integrity, the reason 5 ministers have left is because Keir Starmer's ethics framework worked. We updated it compared to the Conservatives. Remember, Boris Johnson tried to let everybody get away with everything? Keir came in, independent ethics advisor, proper process. That has worked in all of those circumstances, which is why those people have gone. And on economic growth, last year we were projected to grow by 1%. We grew by 1.5%. That was against the odds. And in relation to the other wealthiest nations in the country, was the second quickest growing economy in the G7. So is that good enough? No, of course, we're more ambitious than that. But actually, in the context of what's happening in the world, it was a pretty good start.
When might we come back to have this conversation at the end of this year? Growth per head, which is the measure of living standards, has been flat through the period of your office. When you come back at the end of this year, will growth per head, per capita, be higher?
Well, we actually prefer, if you want to get into it, we prefer real household disposable income as the measure of economic growth.
Yeah, I know, but I'm asking you about...
No, I understand, but the reason I say that is because GDP per capita can change depending on the size of your population. What really matters is whether people at home feel like they've got more money in their pocket by the end of the month. That's real household disposable income, and that's the measure that we use internally in government to track whether economic growth is delivering change for people. That's what will be measured against.
Darren Jones, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Pleasure.
Well, let's stay with the situation in Venezuela now and get the very latest from Washington. Our correspondent David Blevins is there for us. David, you've been having a time for the last 24 hours. What's the situation there now?
Yeah, it's been pretty head-spinning, I suppose, in terms of the dramatic imagery from Venezuela and indeed from New York last night when President Maduro was perp-walked, as the Americans call it, off that plane towards a detention centre in Manhattan, where he and his wife will appear in court tomorrow morning to face very serious federal charges related to drugs trafficking and possession of weapons. But I suppose beyond all of what's going on in a practical sense, there is the political question. And I think it's fair to say there is real disquiet, Trevor, on Capitol Hill about the fact that the president did not seek congressional approval for this in advance, about the fact that he says he's comfortable with US boots on the ground if that's deemed necessary, about how international law was applied or not applied in this case, and about the fact that there is clearly no political plan for Venezuela moving forward, because people remember what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya, what happened in Afghanistan. And it's not just Democrats who have that concern. Republicans also don't want Donald Trump, who was re-elected on an American first platform, leading them back into another long war, and certainly not in midterm election year.
But David, Mr. Trump seems to think that he's learned the lessons of the past. The thing that really surprised me at the press conference, I don't know if it surprised you, was the moment when he said, "We're going to run it." What does that mean, do you think?
Yeah, the jaw-dropping moment for me was when he announced that the US would be running Venezuela in the interim, and we don't yet know what the end game is, who the Americans deem as a suitable candidate to be president of Venezuela in due course. But I think to really understand the extent to which he has shaken up world order is to look back to the 1930s and something called the Monroe Doctrine, when US President James Monroe effectively deemed the Americas a US sphere of influence and warned the Americans to keep out. Donald Trump has revised that in a couple of ways. First of all, he's referring to it not as the Monroe Doctrine, but as the Donroe Doctrine, a reference to himself, of course. But his latest national security strategy also takes it further, suggesting America is not going to stand idly by while its neighbours in the Americas engage in what is described as chronic misbehaviour. So it's not so much a new world order, Trevor, as a turning back the clock nearly 200 years to an old world order to give him the power to do the kind of thing he has done in the last 24 hours. And when you think about how much he's spoken about the Panama Canal and about Greenland, you really begin to understand the extent to which he may have taken the world into new dangerous and unprecedented territory. And you've got to ask, for how much longer can world leaders, and European leaders in particular, continue to sidestep this issue by telling us they are monitoring the situation?
David, thank you so much. I guess you're right now going to be brushing up on your American presidential history. Monroe, Teddy Roosevelt, I think the Roosevelt corollary, I think it was called, and of course Ronald Reagan and Grenada. Thanks very much. No doubt you'll keep us posted all day. Let's see what our panel makes of all this. We're joined all morning by the journalist and broadcaster Mark Urban, the Sunday Times political editor Caroline Wheeler, and the editor-at-large of The Sun, Harry Cole. Caroline, let's start with you. Maybe I was not quite listening, but I think Darren Jones told me the square root of pretty nothing, much nothing.
Well, I think that was the whole purpose of the exercise, wasn't it, Trevor? Which is that what they don't want to be seen to be doing is criticising Donald Trump. We know that one of the few successes of this government has been managing that relationship with Donald Trump, which, if you'd have told us when they came into power that they would have such a good and sort of collaborative relationship, it would have been hard to believe. But they have managed to tame the Donald. And I think that they are very keen to ensure that they don't do anything which sort of sets off any fireworks. But of course, it was quite interesting yesterday. I was working at the Sunday Times yesterday. We had that first statement that came out from Sir Keir Starmer at sort of lunchtime-ish, where it was very much kind of wait and see, holding pattern. We want to see what Donald Trump says in his press conference. Was challenged on international law, wouldn't really say anything other than, you know, pretty much what Darren Jones said to you, which is the basis of the legality of this rests on the Americans. But they did put out another statement later in the day. In fact, it was about 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the evening, where they did mention international law again and said that they were very keen to stress that they are, you know, supportive of international law, as you would expect, given that Sir Keir Starmer is himself a human rights lawyer. So they're very much walking this kind of tightrope between trying to suggest to people that we are, you know, we very much respect international law, but at the same time not wanting to upset Donald Trump.
Mark, what did you make of it?
Well, he seemed relieved when you started asking about Iran, I think it was.
The very only time that ever happened.
Yeah, exactly, out of the frying pan. Yeah, well, it's fascinating, Caroline's point. In a way, Starmer is a sort of curious relic of this period in the 90s when, if you like, there was this progressive overreach, Blair, the Chicago speech, all these ideas about non-intervention, that you could sort of ban war and that you could ban landmines and all sorts of weapons you didn't like, all of which is currently unravelling. You know, you've got the Ukrainians breaching the landmine treaty and Poland and lots of other countries saying they won't go on with it. Because as soon as countries are faced with serious existential questions, a lot of those nice nice-to-have international legal provisions go out of the window. Now, I think we can deduce that if you base your entire response to this around international law, you do risk looking irrelevant, because we live in a world where there's the kind of, the politics of the act, whether that's lifting Maduro out in his pyjamas with Delta Force, whether it's the kind of thing Putin or Xi or Netanyahu or whoever would do. Then you've got the bond markets basically dictating British government policy in all sorts of areas. And then you've got the tech companies who rule our lives in all sorts of ways. So the legalities of this are not necessarily the most salient point. To my mind, the key thing, and the government is going to have to get its thinking together on this, is if it all degenerates in the coming weeks in Caracas and that initial extraordinary coup by US Special Forces proves to be the start of something very unpredictable and unmanageable, what are they going to say then?
Harry, you're over from Washington for a flight, a sort of royal visit.
I know. Wrong town, wrong time.
How's this going to go down in America, particularly with the MAGA crowd?
Well, that's really interesting. I've been monitoring that over the last 24 hours. I've been monitoring the situation, to coin Darren Jones's term there. Look, America First means lots of different things to lots of different people. Obviously, there is the purist isolationist bloc within American politics who don't want any foreign interventions, who are deeply sceptical of any sniff of regime change. And then there is obviously the Donald Trump America First, which actually America First doesn't mean America withdrawn completely. It means gagging and bagging communists in the middle of the night and flying them to New York. He says that's America First because he's putting America's interests first and the American sphere of influence, as David Blevins was discussing there, that Monroe Doctrine. The really interesting thing that's happened in the recent weeks is this national security document that was published by the White House. We all got very excited about them having a pop at Europe and free speech and immigration, but in there it made out very clearly that the new sheriff is in town and he considers his backyard his backyard, and we're seeing that. There's a really interesting point one of the MAGA influencers made overnight, which was, we all said we voted for fewer foreign interventions, but we didn't realise we were going to do this kind of cool stuff. So there is that inherent tension at the middle of it, because it was so well executed, and obviously we've got a long, long way to go. But the initial execution of this, it was over in hours. Minutes.
Less than 5 hours.
Gives the White House a lot of leeway with the base, who, at the end of the day, like a big display of American force, a big successful display of American power. And boy, did they get one last night.
There's moments through the whole thing where you thought you were in a Tom Clancy novel, where Situation Room and all that stuff. But everybody's now going to be familiar with the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that there are spheres of influence, and Latin America is part of the American sphere of influence, where it does what it pretty much wants to do, and everybody in that sphere of influence does what they're told by America. But it looks, Mark, as though we'll come on to the rest of the world in a moment. But America's got a choice. Taking Harry's point, I was reading this morning, there's isolationist America and there's unilateralist America. There's isolationist America, which says we don't want anything to do with the rest of the world. And there's unilateralist America, which says we are in charge and everybody does what we say. This is what's emerging under Trump, isn't it?
I'm not sure. I mean, Trump loves to flout convention and indeed the MAGA base like nothing more than something that appears to ride roughshod over international law. It's empowering in their view. But I see signs that a lot of what Trump is doing is actually about reconciling America to what you might call the multipolar era. And then that's why the Russians and the Chinese, when that policy paper, the National Security Strategy, appeared late last year, were very welcoming of it, because it appeared to step back from the global policeman role and acknowledge the limitations of American power. And we're all waiting for the next policy document, can you believe it, nerding out, which is the National Defence Strategy, which we think is about to relegate military containment of China from first place to further down the list and put the Western Hemisphere stuff as the top US defence priority. So I think in a way they are stepping back from that global policeman role. But of course, classic White House, the cakeist approach is they still want to be able to strike in certain places when they feel an overwhelming imperative to do so. But I think the view in Moscow or Beijing would be that Trump is signalling that he understands America is no longer the hyperpower and has to share its power with them.
I'd like to come back to the wider global point, Iran and all that in a moment, but just very briefly, Caroline, does this make us look a little bit foolish, a little bit small town?
Well, I take your point, Trevor, that you were making to Darren Jones, which was we didn't know about it. In previous years gone by, Margaret Thatcher was informed when there were big, for example, moments. And that hasn't happened. But she was told. She was told, and that hasn't happened here. And so, it's obviously a big moment. It does feel like we're sort of standing on the sidelines somewhat and watching a big international moment. But I think, as I said earlier, I think the point is that it is this tightrope that we're walking because we don't want to upset Donald Trump because our interests are intertwined with his.
It is 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Donald Trump says the United States will run Venezuela following the capture of former President Nicolas Maduro. He has now arrived in the United States and is being held in New York on drug trafficking charges. Meanwhile, a new president is in place in Caracas. But she seems to be defying Trump by calling for Maduro's release and return. In the last hour, the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister has told this programme the government here won't judge the United States' actions. Well, let's get some immediate reaction from the official opposition here now. I can speak to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Priti Patel.
Morning, Trevor.
Good morning, Shadow Foreign Secretary. What did you make of Mr. Trump's announcement yesterday, particularly his decision that the United States would now be running Venezuela?
Well, I think there are a number of points to make, Trevor, to be quite frank. And, the world sort of watched yesterday, I think, this big jaw-dropping moment, but failed to recognise that the United States of America under President Trump has been really putting together one hell of an armada out around Venezuela, taking out serious boats that have all been involved in illegal, illicit drug trade and trafficking. And I was in Washington in November when the national security strategy was released, and I'm afraid there are a lot of people in Britain, Europe, that basically almost sort of were quite, shrill and churlish about the strategy, where it clearly said that President Trump was going to be asserting American influence. And you've already mentioned, I think David did as well, your Washington correspondent, about, the Roosevelt corollary and the history, the Monroe Doctrine. That national security strategy was crystal clear that America under Trump was going to assert itself when it came to issues of chronic wrongdoing that were having a big impact on the United States. And it pointed to Latin America in particular. So should we have anticipated this? Absolutely. And it's just interesting now to listen to the responses and the reactions. That press conference yesterday was extraordinary. I have to say the military dissection and the explanation of the operation that took place was extraordinary, done to precision. No doubt they're clearly very proud of the way in which they executed that. But the fundamental questions now are all political. It's what next? What about the people that are going to come in? What about the fundamental principle of democracy? Monroe was a terrible tyrant. He was an illegitimate tyrant who oppressed his own people.
Before we get on to that, I do want to ask you about that. You sound rather enthusiastic about this. Straightforwardly, you think this was a good thing, well executed. Applause for the White House.
First of all, I've just given you the context around what America chose to do, what President Trump chose to do. For those of us that have been following this, it's pretty clear that was the direction of travel. The execution, I think we should just recognise this. It happened very quickly, and the Americans, the government are clearly, we're all watching this, and we only know what was said yesterday. We're now watching this from the ultimate implications of what this means.
I wasn't asking you for a commentary on it. I was asking you whether you support it or not. And
Well,
it sounds
look,
like
the
you do.
fact that Monroe is gone, we absolutely support. This guy was an oppressive tyrant. He was a
In this
complete
way, in this
dictator. He was
fashion?
responsible for all sorts of terrible things. And I think that's welcome. The Americans are now going to go through their own process in terms of how this is handled. And clearly there's a court indictment now against Monroe and his wife. And it's interesting from a legal perspective.
For a
they're focusing
straight-talking
on the
Essex
drugs.
MP, you seem to be reluctant to say whether you thought this was a good idea, a good thing to do or not.
Just said no one's going to cry over the fact that Maduro has gone. That is a very clear statement that he was a terrible tyrant. We've never, ever supported his illegal, illegitimate government at all. So on this basis, the question is fundamentally political. What happens next? That is a fact. That really is in terms of what the direction of travel is and what happens next. And that's something we've all got to consider. There is also, the point about drugs is very serious because the United Kingdom in the past has been involved in operations and security cooperation with the United States on stopping drugs from Latin America coming to the United Kingdom. There was speculation just towards the end of last year that the United Kingdom had stopped sharing intelligence with the US administration over this issue as well. So, you know, there's a lot of questions that will obviously follow.
Well, one question that follows is that Mr. Trump says that the Americans are going to run Venezuela themselves until further notice. I think that's a new version of colonialism.
Well, this is my point about the political direction of travel. We believe in democracy, and the question has to be now, these are political questions about what that pathway to democracy is going to be for Venezuela. There was an opposition leader who won the previous election in 2024, which Maduro clearly cancelled that result. So I think these are the important questions that we should be asking. I'm sure these are questions the British Foreign Secretary will ask of her counterpart. I hope those conversations will take place. You've already discussed the fact that the United Kingdom was not engaged on any of this, which I don't think is that surprising. This was a highly classified operation. I think fundamentally all the questions now are all political, and whether or not, don't forget there are British nationals in Venezuela as well. We have to think about some of the practicalities here too.
Just quickly, a couple quick questions on the Middle East, which is where you are right now. What do you think the Iranians are going to make of this? Do you think that they can see another Trump expedition heading their way?
I think, again, when it comes to Iran, we've seen these extraordinary protests over recent days. You know, these are brave people. They've been protesting for many years now. Trump has already taken enormous action against Iran on those nuclear facilities last summer, and that brought a cessation, obviously, to the 12-day war, as it was called at the time. I think Iran will clearly watch anything and everything America does. It's pretty volatile in Iran right now. We know that there are various groups and organizations that are protesting for different things and different outcomes for Iran. Quite fundamentally, I think this is also a big moment for the United Kingdom because it speaks to about our direction of travel vis-a-vis Iran, how we work with D3, snapback sanctions, some of the circumvention of sanctions that have been taking place. These have all been widely reported and documented. So I have no doubt that the Iranian regime will be watching this very closely.
Lastly, can I just ask you about Abdel al-Fattah? This man gained British citizenship while you were Home Secretary. I understand that you supported the campaign to have him released. Do you feel any embarrassment about that right now?
Oh, first of all, I have not been an advocate in terms of someone that's been, calling for him constantly to be released or anything of that nature. The fact of the matter is, over the last, I think now, 7 to 10 days, so much more information has come out about what he's been saying, his conduct, and we're very clear that he should have his citizenship now stripped based upon him being non-conducive to the public good. He's failed all the tests.
But you gave it to him. Didn't anybody actually just have a look at what he had said previously before you decided to give him a British passport?
Basis. You have to go back. Context does matter here. You have to go back to look at the legal basis. I did not make the ultimate decision around his citizenship. Let's just be clear about that. There was a case with the ECHR back in 2019 that had implications for those who could gain citizenship through their parents, their mother in this case, and the various tests, the good life tests, were not considered because of ECHR to be relevant at the time. You know the position of my party right now. We're very clear about leaving the ECHR because of all these types of issues that get thrown up. Fundamentally, we think the system needs to be reformed and changed. We've been putting forward proposals on that. And on top of that right now, we've been very clear that we just don't think he can have British citizenship. And this is now an onus and a focus for the UK government to basically use the laws and the powers that Parliament have given them to ensure that he's stripped of that citizenship.
Sorry, thank you very much, Priti Patel, for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Okay, back to our panel. Tom, Caroline and Harry. Why am I saying Tom? I mean Mark.
Where's Tom?
And let me ask you, Mark, that we were going to go on, I think, to talk about what this set of events this weekend might mean elsewhere. Of course, one of the things that's being said now, and I think will be said pretty loudly during the week, is that this will offer encouragement, a shelter for aggressors such as Putin and possibly the Chinese Communist Party and its designs on Taiwan.
I think it's a political gift to them, and we've already seen the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Chinese making hay, as you would expect, and exposing what they would say is a double standard. I don't think a decision, are we going to unleash thousands of fighter planes and warplanes at Taiwan, is ultimately going to depend on, well, we can say Trump did something similar in Venezuela. I don't think it's going to work like that. When Xi has to make that decision about Taiwan, the primary purpose, the primary criteria for him is going to be to do with, is it going to work, or am I going to look very foolish if I start this war with Taiwan? It's not going to depend on American behaviour. And we know well enough that Putin does pretty much what he wants anyway with regard to international law and has flouted it in many different ways over a long period of time. So I think it's part of this decay, accelerated decay of the so-called rules-based order. Clearly, it was the case for many years that the Americans were sort of the only people who still believed in it. And you can say, what about Iraq in 2003 and all the rest of it? That's fair comment. But now, of course, with Trump, there's an almost enthusiastic discarding of that rules-based system. And that does have a wider effect, I think, in terms of the sort of permissiveness of direct action.
This whole idea of the international rules-based order, I think, slightly depends on where you view it from, doesn't it? The Americans, of course, have done this before. I mentioned Grenada earlier on. They took Noriega out of Panama, I think, the back end of the 1980s, and there are examples elsewhere. Do you think America is going to be particularly disturbed about the idea of destroying the international rules-based order?
I mean, of all the, excuse my language, of all the centrist copium we've seen over the last 48 hours about all this idea that this is going to somehow encourage Vladimir Putin to do something bad, like invade Ukraine, or the idea that Xi gives a flying fig what anyone is tweeting in their great sort of commentaries about this, or the fact that the West might somehow think about. Read any speech he's ever said. Read any policy document ever put out by the Communist Party. They don't care what we think. So this idea that we're suddenly, giving excuse to tyrants around the world by doing things, I think is for the birds. I think domestically, for the White House and for Trump, I think, and you can see why even Priti Patel and the opposition are being quite reticent in giving this its full-throated backing, even though it was pretty clear, I think, there that she's a supporter of this. The Canadian opposition have gone a little bit further. As you said earlier, the French have gone a little bit further in saying this is a good thing. But the reason everyone is still holding back, I think, is just because we don't know what's going to happen in the next few months. This could go south very quickly. There could be a power vacuum. Whether, the White House yesterday, President Marco Rubio was very coy in quite what that means about them running it, what this committee is. Will they be okay as long as the vice president does as she's told, essentially? We'll see how that plays out. I mean, you have to be pretty optimistic to say this is going to be hitch-free.
I was struck by the way that in what Rubio said yesterday at the press conference, didn't take him very long to get to Cuba, which is, of course, has been his issue. He's of Cuban heritage. His family, I think, fled Castro and so on. Is Cuba next in line?
Well, I think it's a domino effect, really. Mark will know this better than I and probably explain it more eloquently than I, but my understanding of it is that Cuba is in a dire strait. It is entirely reliant almost on oil subsidies from Caracas, and if those turned off, things could go south there pretty quickly. Obviously, it is a bugbear, and rightly so, I think, for not only Marco Rubio, but millions of Cubans and millions of Venezuelan exiles in the United States. So I don't think there'll be many tears shed in Florida. I think Miami was probably quite a party town to be in last night, and if Cuba's next, I think that can only be a good thing for for the free world.
It's a good point, and Trump made the point, by the way, in the press conference that all the Venezuelans who had fled, I think there are now 9 million. Colombia alone's got 3 million Venezuelan refugees. At some point, will be able to go home, and the great oil revenues they're going to start generating will make that possible. Do you think that the implications are wide? I've been asking about Iran. Do you think this is now going to be limited to America's backyard, or is this a signal for something wider?
I think an operation of this kind in Iran would be of an altogether different order of complexity. But I do think it is right, if you're sitting in Havana, this is a very grim portent, because we now know that the CIA had a team on the ground in Caracas from August, so they had covert operatives. The Cuban intelligence services apparently had people in with Maduro trying to thwart exactly this type of eventuality. They conspicuously failed.
Yeah, his bodyguards were Cuban, not Venezuelan.
All of this, and then the weaponry, the advanced ground-to-air missiles, things like that the Russians and others had provided for the Venezuelans, also all conspicuously failed. So if you were to ask, well, what is the entire defensive system of the Cuban regime, from armed forces to intelligence services and all the rest of it, they now seem to be completely exposed. Whether Trump would be tempted to do so, who knows? But they must be very worried.
Bring us back home, Caroline. We're joking about Darren Jones's sort of straight bat and boycott-like performance and so on, but this presents a bit of a big dilemma for Keir Starmer, doesn't it? I mean, he has positioned himself as the leader of the coalition of the willing, the Trump whisperer, all that sort of business, and that has all evaporated pretty much in the last 24 hours.
Well, I think there's always been a kind of a tension there for Sir Keir Starmer, because actually there are lots of people within his own party that don't like Donald Trump at all. In fact, even members of his own cabinet have said some fairly extraordinary things about Donald Trump in the past. So there's always been this kind of nervousness about being too close to Donald Trump. But given the world in which we live at the moment, the fact that we've done a trade deal with the United States, the fact that they are flexing their muscles, the fact that we need them on side to help resolve that situation in the Ukraine, and we seem to be tiptoeing towards some sort of resolution there. There's going to be another meeting, I think, in Paris on Tuesday. It's really difficult because they don't want to rock the boat too much. But of course, there are already people within the Labour Party, Nadia Whitmore, for example, Richard Bergen, have come out very strongly condemning this and saying that this is a flagrant breach of international law and shouldn't be able to stand, which is going to create those tensions. And of course, it's not just the split there that you're going to see, because there is now another left-wing party, which is your party, and you've got people like Zara Sultana and, of course, Jeremy Corbyn, who's always been a kind of vocal proponent of Venezuela, saying again that this is an absolute travesty and shouldn't be allowed to hold. So it will create tensions, and I'm surprised in some ways it hasn't been a bigger Twitter storm than has already been created, but I'd say watch this space when Parliament returns.
It's Sunday. It's closed. Mark?
I think a lot is going to depend on who emerges as the leader presumptive. You've got Eduardo González Urrutia, who was the guy who properly won the 2024. So logically, he should become the president, or there should be a new election. Then there's Maria Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. Is she going to be part of it? Now, Trump appeared to diss her, but then again, you'd probably do that if you didn't want someone to look like your proxy or dupe. So if those sorts of figures
Goodness
emerge,
me.
I think it will...
The sinuousness of your mind. I mean...
Well, that's political warfare, isn't it? I think that would calm the horses, as it were, in the European political leadership, because those are respectable figures. But if the existing Vice President, Maduro's number 2, carries on, then things look much more doubtful, I think.
In a moment, we will continue talking Venezuela, and we will look to reforms year ahead with their Deputy Leader, Richard Tice.
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist? I'm going to take you behind the scenes here for Election Night Live. They have gone up and up. Being a Sky News journalist. Ed Conway, Sky News, is anyone going to talk to us? Mortgage rates did go up very sharply during your time in office. Here it is. First off, just the scale of what we're looking at. Our data shows it's been happening. Question is, why it hasn't been stopped.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News presenter?
We've done the work and the reading, so you don't have to.
Being a Sky News presenter.
Hello and welcome. Westminster, the heart of British politics.
I'm so sorry about what happened to you.
So what on earth is going on?
It's not true.
Can I tell you what I think? It's really unusual. Mornings with Richard and Frost. Let's crack on. Let's get started.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News journalist?
Who's funnier?
Being a Sky News journalist.
A special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim.
Pakistan has the right to respond.
You're like, what?
A historic day here today. Congratulations, this is a huge moment. But what happens now?
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist?
They call him the king of the jungle.
Being a Sky News journalist.
Yusra Al-Baghir has this report.
And this is what's left of it.
As a woman of colour, how did the Harris campaign speak to you?
People risk their lives to speak to us for this report.
Mr. Zuma, Sky News.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
Yesterday, Reform leader Nigel Farage said the United States' actions in Venezuela were unorthodox and contrary to international law, but also may be a good thing if they make China and Russia think twice. The party's deputy leader, Richard Tice, is with me. Isn't there a contradiction there? Why you support something that is against international law?
Well, the reality is that it's good news that a serious enemy of the West, Maduro, has been removed. He was illegitimate. The UK, the US, the EU have said that for many, many years. And the people who will be worried, actually, are Putin and the Chinese communist regime, because Maduro was supplying significant oil supplies and was a threat to US interests. And that's ultimately what the US have determined. And it's clearly in accordance with US domestic law. Lawyers will argue, of course, about UN Article 51. The reality is that an enemy of the West has been removed. The challenge now, and I think you were touching on it earlier, is to ensure that you don't end up with a vacuum that slides into what happened in Iraq and Libya. That's the key challenge.
If I remember rightly, Article 51 is the one that permits action on foreign soil if there are extreme circumstances.
If it's in self-defence and if other states are unwilling or unable, and you get into sort of real legal technicalities around it, there'll be a report sent to the UN Security Council on that. As I say, the key point, the practical reality is that an enemy of the West has been removed and Putin will be uncomfortable. And what you haven't mentioned was the President's comment yesterday that he is not thrilled with President Putin. I think actually for Ukraine, that is good news.
Well, the reason I was referring to what the Article 51 actually said, it seems that this is sort of stretching that a little bit to the point where perhaps any country that the United States disapproves of could expect a visit from the Delta Force on the basis of what you've just said.
Well, look, the US Constitution gives the right to the Commander-in-Chief, the US President, to act in the self-defence of US citizens.
So you're OK with him trotting around the world,
that is a matter
abducting presidents?
That is a matter for the US President. But equally, just yesterday...
Hang on.
Equally, yesterday, British Typhoon fighters bombed weapons dumps in Syria because we concluded that actually it's in our self-defence, it's in our national interest, that that's the right thing to do. So it's not just the US, actually, that is acting overseas, and I fully support that.
Yeah, but I think that was in coordination with the Syrian government. It seems to me, though, that what you seem to be backing, and this is not a criticism, it's just trying to understand where you are on this, that you're backing a rather active foreign policy in which the United States is able to decide that a particular leader isn't really doing the job that the United States thinks it should do, as opposed to what its own people say.
The role of any government, any prime minister or president, is to look after the self-defence of its own citizens. And that's what Trump is doing. Unfortunately, this Labour government have not done that in UK interests with regard to Chagos, for example, that they've given away.
Before we get to that, but Mr. Putin would make exactly the same point. He says that he is threatened by NATO's advance to his borders under Ukraine, and he makes exactly the point you've just made.
Apples and pears, nonsense, Trevor. He wanted to invade the whole of Ukraine and to keep it. President Trump has made it quite clear this is an illegitimate...
we're going to run Venezuela until we decide we don't want to.
Until a successful, peaceful transition to a democratically elected...
Is over?
Well, the challenge is to prevent chaos descending into Venezuela. That's the key point.
But I think I understand exactly the case you're making, but I'm finding it very difficult to understand why you think that Mr. Trump saying we need to remove this bad guy from Venezuela because his narco activities threaten us in the United States, and we're going to remove him. Mr. Putin says there are fascists and Nazis in Ukraine that threaten our borders.
Trevor,
we're going to remove them.
It's chalk and cheese. There is no comparison whatsoever.
Well, that's because you wanted to be.
No, there's no comparison. Putin has never said he was going to give Ukraine back to the Ukrainians. He just wanted to get rid of
and
Zelensky.
Mr. Trump has not yet said
different. He literally said it yesterday.
Good. All right. Do you think that this is going to have an effect elsewhere in the world? We're thinking particularly about Cuba and Iran that we've been talking about.
I think those rogue states will be thinking very, very carefully. And I supported and congratulated Israel and the US for taking out Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran is a serious threat to our safety and our interests. And Cuba, yes, they'll be thinking very carefully about their actions.
All right. Can I just get one thing clear? Am I talking to a future Reform Chancellor if you were fortunate enough to be in government?
Well, ultimately, the boss decides, but you hopefully are talking to someone who is part of a Reform government after the next generation.
So he hasn't promised you...
The sooner that happens, the better.
He hasn't promised you the Treasury yet?
Well, the great thing is that there are many talents in Reform UK, and we all do a range of jobs. We're talking about foreign policy this morning.
I'm utterly baffled that the Deputy Leader, a big fish like you, hasn't been told by the party leader the Chancellorship is yours.
I don't share everything with you on a Sunday morning, Trevor.
Oh, come on, it's just us.
It's just us, no one else.
All right. One of the things you have said that you would do is get rid of the OBR, or at least question its right to pronounce on economic plans. How would you reassure the markets that whatever plans you have make any sense at all? Because that's what the OBR does.
Well, ultimately, who runs Britain? Is it the Chancellor and the Prime Minister determining policy, or is it the quangos at the OBR? And I put out on social media yesterday, advisors advise and directors, or in this case ministers, decide. And the OBR has got way above itself. Its forecasts generally are of woeful quality, and there are other ways of doing things, and that's what Nigel messaged out. We've had grave concerns about the OBR for some time, but maybe if they do their job properly, fine. There is, for example, another alternative way you could look at. You could say to the markets, why don't we take an average of the top 10 main consensus forecasters and use that as your benchmark? There's a range of ways of doing it.
One thing that we can start to see about what a youth reform government might do is look at what the councils you control are doing. And we can argue about individual decisions. I don't want to get into all of that. But I just want to ask you a more general question. You want to cut costs. Given that 60% of council spending in England is now mandated by law for adult and children's social care, are you finding that you just don't have the room for manoeuvre in those local councils that you'd hoped?
No, we always knew that, as you say, you've got, for example, SEND, children's services, adult social care. But on SEND, for example, we've said very clearly, we've set up a working group because SEND is special educational needs, is out of control. The government has delayed, regrettably, a white paper on this for about 12 months now. But we want to be at the heart of SEND reforms where you could actually improve outcomes for children.
How would you cut the costs?
Well, you can actually, for example, on special educational needs, private equity-owned independent schools are making off like bandits whilst outcomes for the most needy children are not improving. So those are the sort of things that we need to look at to get better outcomes for children whilst reducing costs. On adult social care, for example... Hang on.
Reform is going to nationalise social care.
No, I didn't say that, Trevor. I didn't say that. I just said there are things you can do better. I'm head of Doge. I'm all over this, right? So on special educational needs, we can do things better. On adult social care, there are different ways of providing a equivalent or better quality service. On pension funds, the mismanagement and the underperformance of the local government pension schemes is an absolute scandal that I exposed. We could save up to £1 billion a year just in our councils if we can do that properly. So there's much we can do.
We will talk more about this during the year, no doubt in the run-up to the local elections.
We're going to do very well, and we're looking forward to it, as long as we have them. Some are being cancelled, we fear.
We shall see. Richard Tice, thank you for your time this morning. In just a moment, we'll hear from the former chief of MI6, Sir John Soares.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News presenter?
We've done the work and the reading, so you don't have to.
Being a Sky News presenter.
Hello and welcome. Westminster, the heart of British politics.
I'm so sorry about what happened to you.
So what on earth is going on?
It's not true.
Can I tell you what I think? It's really unusual. Mornings with Richard Tice. Let's crack on. Let's get started.
Well, let's talk about the implications of Donald Trump's actions in Venezuela again. I can speak to the former head of the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, Sir John Sawers. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Trevor.
Can we just start with what I think in your business they sometimes call modalities or operations? You've obviously done many planning exercises for this kind of thing. How long do you think the Americans have been planning this?
Well, I've certainly never been involved in abducting a foreign leader onto national soil, so that is a new territory.
That's what you say, John.
But the reality is that these operations do take many months of planning, and as you said earlier on your program, there was a CIA team on the ground for several months. They've obviously got sources inside Maduro's security detail. They've had a massive buildup of US military forces, including US Special Forces. So it was an operation months in the planning. And obviously there are question marks about legality and what comes next. But as a military operation, it was very effective.
Would you, I know you haven't been involved in this, let's agree that. But do you think if you had been doing something like this, you would have been advised that this was of dubious legality or indeed illegal?
Well, in the UK, this would not have passed muster, and nor in countries of Europe, because the legal base that I think the Trump administration are relying upon is one of law enforcement rather than defense. You mentioned earlier in your talk with Richard Tice the Article 51 of the UN Charter. I don't think the UN Americans are relying on that at all. There's a meeting of the UN Security Council tomorrow on this issue, and we'll see what's said there. But what they're relying upon is US domestic law, law enforcement, and the use of military force to protect those carrying out the what they would see as a lawful arrest. Now, for us, that's a real stretch legally. I'm not a lawyer myself, but and I think not surprising that Keir Starmer and his government have distanced themselves from this operation without actually making any criticism of it, because it wouldn't have passed muster here in the UK. But Americans are a law unto themselves, and in some ways, this was an assertion of American power, raw American power, and a message to others, especially in the Western Hemisphere, who might want to stand up against American power.
When the Prime Minister says he didn't know anything about it, Darren Jones says we were not warned. There are two ways in which one can read that. You can read that as the government saying, nothing to do with us, completely American. The other way you can read that is, what were our security services, particularly your old outfit, doing that they didn't see this coming?
Well, I don't know exactly what they advised the Prime Minister, but it was pretty clear that the military build-up in the Caribbean was aimed at securing some form of regime change in Venezuela. I think the evidence suggests that we have distanced ourselves from that there were reports, which I can't verify, can't corroborate, but there were reports that there was some withholding of intelligence in the Caribbean region because we didn't want to get ourselves tied up with operations which were not legally cleared under the UK system. So I don't think there's any responsibility here on the UK side. I'm sure good analysis was put to the Prime Minister about what the American options were and what they might do. Whether they predicted the abduction of Maduro, I don't know.
As we've seen in the past, the regime change isn't always that easy. You know, Iraq, any number of Latin American regimes and so on. What do you think this is going to tell us about the American posture towards Iran and the possibilities for Iran and what Iran should have to fear?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think I'd be cautious about using the phrase regime change. The Americans have abducted the leader of Venezuela, Maduro, and taken him to the US to stand trial. But they are now already dealing with the regime. The army remains in power, the legal structures of the regime remain unchanged, and they're already talking to Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president who's been sworn in as the new president of Venezuela, and distance themselves from the opposition. So this isn't the sort of regime change of the sort that we saw in Iraq, and it's commensurate with the clear reluctance by Trump to put large-scale forces on the ground. He wants to deal with the existing regime. Now, what does this mean for Iran? Well, Venezuela was part of that grouping with Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, Zimbabwe, choose your rogue state, who stuck together and supported one another. So Venezuela's loss is a short-term. Maduro's departure is a short-term loss for that sort of axis of powers. But in the long term, I think this gives a license to people like the Russians and the Chinese to use force in their own neighborhood. Now, what does it mean for Iran? Well, the situation in Iran is very interesting. There have been these widespread protests across the country, reaching some 170 towns and cities across the entire state of Iran. And a certain number of people have been killed, about 15, I think. But the regime has held back from using full force because it doesn't want to attract another attack from Israel or the Americans. But of course, if the Americans and the Israelis do start calling for regime change as a result of this, that has an unpredictable effect. When the Americans and the Israelis were bombing Iran's nuclear facilities, there was a certain rallying around the flag. Nobody wanted to be associated with the Israelis in particular. So I think the Israelis got limited power in Iran, limited influence. These protests in Iran will have their own dynamic, they will have their own momentum, but they haven't got to the stage yet where they're seriously regime threatening. And if they did get to that level, I think we would see a heavy use of regime force to clamp down on it. We're not in a 1979 situation. This is a problem for the regime, but not yet regime threatening.
Sir John Sawyers, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Trevor.
Well, in just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
Mr. Trump, James Matthews from Sky News.
Hey, James.
Did you stay at the apartment in Manhattan of Jeffrey Epstein?
I'm not answering any questions.
Are you an appeaser for Putin?
I think that I really don't care what David Cameron has to say.
Mr. Patel, did you endanger public safety when you said the killer was in custody? Does your past behaviour make you unfit to serve? I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C.
People that pod together, they have a little hive brain going on.
They've not had a good week.
I've had a good week. There's a teaser there, a teaser.
Oof. OK, nothing to see here. Drama over.
Full stop.
Anyway, we'll get to that.
She will be mortified.
She's the first female chancellor.
I popped upstairs, made myself a cheese sandwich, and now I'm with you.
Annalise has come dressed in the magenta of electoral dysfunction. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Fire, shouts the commander. There's a dash to safety.
We've now got to wait inside the shelter to see if there is incoming.
I'm Deborah Haynes, Sky's security and defence editor. Should Russia's war with Ukraine escalate significantly, pilots like these could be called upon to go into combat for real.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News presenter?
We've done the work and the reading, so you don't have to.
Being a Sky News presenter.
Hello and welcome. Westminster, the heart of British politics.
I'm so sorry about what happened to you.
So what on earth is going on?
It's not true.
Can I tell you what I think? It's really unusual. Mornings with Richard Frost. Let's crack on. Let's get started.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News journalist?
Who's funnier?
Being a Sky News journalist.
A special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim.
Pakistan had the right to respond.
You're like, what?
Historic day here today. Congratulations, this is a huge moment. But what happens now?
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist?
They call him the king of the jungle.
Being a Sky News journalist.
Yusra al-Baghir has this report.
And this is what's left of it.
As a woman of colour, how did the Harris campaign speak to you?
People risk their lives to speak to us for this report.
Mr. Zuma, Sky News.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
Back to our panel, Mark, Caroline and Harry. The big political event domestically this year is going to be the May elections, and in spite of the cancellations, as Richard Tice is complaining about, there will still be votes for various local councils, and particularly Scotland and Wales. How serious is this going to be for whom, Caroline?
Well, very serious. I mean, the predictions, and in fact the Sunday Times had a poll which was actually based on parliamentary seats rather than local council seats, which are more difficult to poll, suggests that the impact could be absolutely tumultuous, particularly for the Labour Party, which is going to cede seats right across the board to Reform, but also potentially to the Greens and other more minor parties. And this is something which is very much focusing the minds of MPs in Westminster at the moment, who are obviously, incredibly concerned, particularly about the losses that they're going to see potentially in Wales, but also in Scotland. And for that reason, there is a lot of chatter about leadership and whether or not Sir Keir Starmer is going to be able to see the incoming storm through, because, all of these MPs are looking over their shoulders. They're going to be looking at those results in May. They're going to be looking at them as a sort of midterms, to bring a kind of American analogy. And when they come in, they're going to be thinking, are we going to have our seats? Because the latest poll prediction, the MRP that More in Common did for us this weekend, suggests that Labour could be down to as few as 85 seats.
From whatever it is, 411, is it?
Yeah, which is, it's an extinction sort of moment for them. So there is a lot of chatter about Sir Keir Starmer's future. But as one Labour minister put it to me this week, we're in a kind of stick or twist moment. The hand that they've got is not looking particularly positive. But what they don't want to do is to pick up another card and make that deck worse for them. And I think that's where we find ourselves. I mean, what we're hearing a lot about Wes Streeting. He's the one that would benefit from going early if there was going to be a contest. But there's also a lot of people that are saying Starmer surviving is underpriced because, it's a big effort to get rid of a leader and you've got to be sure about who you're going to get at the end of it. What you don't want to do is to twist and end up with going bust by getting somebody that you didn't intend or didn't want.
We've all been playing a lot of cards over Christmas.
I have, actually. Lots of whist.
Harry, you fell out of love with the government, didn't you?
Oh, but I mean, look, I think I wouldn't be alone in this country of sort of pointing out that this country was crying out for change after 14 years of the Conservatives and being quite disappointed with the change that was delivered fairly rapidly, not literally tearing up manifestos, springing things on the country that weren't mentioned before the election, and fundamentally trying to unpick the biggest democratic result in British history. 10 years ago, the Brexit referendum happened, and it looks like this government's going to try and undo that. And I think if you're going to try and hand Nigel Farage the keys to Downing Street, you're going about a pretty good way of doing that if you're going to reopen that particular battle. But I agree with Caroline that, it's kind of better the devil you know, really. Keir Starmer is in a much stronger position than he looks. I think mainly because I don't think the left of the party will wear streeting. I don't think the unions will have a particular truck for him. And, you know, the worst-case scenario for the Labour Party would be to some sort of bizarre lurch to the left, when already the left is actually a pretty crowded field. Look what happened to the Germans, the German Socialist Party in, what was it, last year? Or the year before? Last year, in their elections. They lost about 11% of their support, and they were wiped out. You know, Keir Starmer, if you believe in the polls at the moment, is bleeding out 14, 15, 16%. That's not just a reform, that's to the Greens, it's to the Gaza independents, as we so lovely euphemistically call some of those guys. You know, he's in a real bind, and I just think, actually, almost a sort of, to draw a horrible analogy to what's going on in global affairs, it's like, well, we don't know, the known unknowns are so big that actually you're not going to have the 80 or so MPs willing to pull the trigger for fear of unknown.
All right, I'm not going to tax you all to speculate. We don't do speculation. We're above that on this programme.
Informed speculation.
So informed speculation. Thank you, Harry. So let's look at a poll that's been done by our friends at More in Common, where they asked people, the public, what certain events, how likely certain events were, and they compared them. So let me start with the first couple. Is England playing in the World Cup final more or less likely than Keir Starmer resigning or being removed? Mark, which one?
Oh, my Lord. I'm the wrong person to ask. I was just thinking, well, if were England to win the World Cup final, that could improve Keir Starmer's survival chances.
Oh, they said that about Boris, it didn't work.
Quick answer.
Oh, my Lord.
Which one? World Cup or...
Starmer.
I think I'm going to say Starmer as well, just given that he is so unpopular, the most unpopular Prime Minister in history.
Given the route to reaching the final in the World Cup, which goes through Brazil, Argentina and all our friends, I would say if England comes second in the group, they've got more chance of reaching the World Cup final.
All right.
But that's, I'm overthinking.
Here's what the public thought.
Yay!
Yeah, you win. Let's have another one. UK enters a recession or Keir Starmer resigns or removed. Higher or lower? Carrie?
I think the UK economy is in better nick than even Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have given it credit for. I don't think we enter a recession. I think we bump around at a paltry 1% growth. So
I have to agree with Harry. I actually think the prospects for the economy are looking a little better than some would even consider.
Well, I'll have to go with the team view then and say still Starmer.
The public disagrees with you. Public thinks we're going to be in a recession. OK. And the other one that people are interested in, waiting lists. More waiting lists down or not? Higher or lower? Caroline?
Oh, I think people are going to be pessimistic about the NHS because I think that those people that are waiting for those operations are generally more vocal. So I'm going to say people are going to be more pessimistic about the prospects for waiting lists.
I'd go with the other way, more pessimistic on the economy.
I'd say more pessimistic on the economy because, I mean, people who are on the waiting list are very, as Caroline says, very vocal about it.
Harry and Mark. 60% think that we're going to end into a recession. I think we've got time for one more, haven't we? Trump versus Badenoch. Which one goes first?
I think they both last the course at this rate. Someone needs to own what's going to happen to the Tory party in May, which is going to be appalling. But she's had a good few weeks, actually. She seems to have got the knack of PMQs. I think it's very hard to remove Donald Trump.
I think Badenoch more likely to resign, but I do agree with Harry. I think that she's had a better few weeks, and I think that the kind of knives are not out for her in the way that they perhaps were.
Well, I'm thinking you were talking about May and Starmer, but of course Trump has his midterms. And I think that is key to this question, and indeed whether the succession battle begins afterwards, or does he start talking up a third term? Yeah. So I think Kemi less likely to last.
Well, funnily enough, actually, the public basically thinks both of them are going to be here next year, but Kemi just a little bit more. Here's a really interesting one that I want to end with. Actually, this generally surprised me. Here are 7 things that people are asked they thought were likely to happen. What do you think is the most likely thing?
Riots.
Yeah, I think riots.
Cyber attack. Cyber attack disrupting UK infrastructure.
Well, it's very interesting. Let's show. Public agreed with you. Riots and cyber attacks. That's quite gloomy. What do you think would provoke riots, Caroline?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, it takes something often unpredictable, like what we saw in Southport. I mean, you might say something like Brexit and rollback.
Not sorry to interrupt, but from sitting where I'm sitting 5,000 miles away most of the time, the country looks like a tinderbox. And I think you are one migrant assault rape incident away from a town going up in flames.
You think that the issue of asylum hotels and all of that is still
it really does
very...
look like it is simmering in a really nasty way.
Mark?
Well, I think it is. And, of course, that is a key part of the political calculus at the moment, the whole immigration question. On the Ukraine war, I mean, that's an interesting one. I might say price ceasefire is a rather higher possibility than they did there.
22%.
Yeah. But as for the war ending, or is it another pause? That's another question.
Are you reckoning you're going to be writing a piece this year that says, thank God the war in Ukraine is over?
I think it's quite likely that there will be a ceasefire or an armistice or something that brings it to a halt. But is the struggle between those two nations over? Okay. I think not.
Thank you all very much. It's been fascinating to be... great to be back, actually.
Happy New Year.
That is it for this week's show. I'll be back next Sunday. Watch Politics Hub, 7 o'clock every night this week.